Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, after the great political novels and the great political dramas, we're going to be talking about something related but very different. I'm speaking to the writers and academics Seamus Perry and Mark Ford. They are the hosts of the LRB's brilliant Close Readings podcast, about what makes a great political poem. Maybe we could start with just trying to define how you defined the scope of this series. So I've been doing a series on great political fictions, and people often say, well, why does that one count? Why did that one get in? And it's quite loosely defined. When you were coming up with the poems for this one, where did you draw the line? What gets in or what maybe didn't get in because it wasn't political enough? Because some of them clearly are very political. They are about political events and they have strong political themes, but some of them it's a little looser. Did you struggle to know where to draw the line?
So one initial prompt to this was an anthology that Mark and I were both familiar with, edited by Tom Paulin some years ago, called The Faber Book of Political Verse. And it was a very interesting and kind of stimulating, provocative sort of anthology, because Paulin very deliberately included within the book poems that would not normally be categorized as political, I suppose, in most university or school syllabuses, for example. And one of the test case poems was Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard, written in the middle part of the 18th century, which doesn't have any mention of any 18th century politics in it at all. And Gray, if called upon, could have had a line on Walpole, for example, but he doesn't have anything about that in the Elegy. And the reason it gets into Paulin's anthology, I guess, is because there's a very celebrated reading of a couple of stanzas in it by William Empson in the 1930s. And these are stanzas in which Gray looks upon the obscure rural dead that lie all around him, whose lives have come to nothing. And Gray says, well, that's just natural. That's what it's like. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air. And Emerson's point is that although that isn't ostensibly a political sentiment, actually in some senses implicitly it is, because it's saying there's nothing that a changed system of new political structures or something could do to prevent this human wastage. It's just hardwired into the way that the moral universe works, and you can't do anything about it. Whereas if you were a progressive socialist of some kind, let's say, you might think you could do something about the waste of obscure human lives. And so that's the kind of rather difficult case that Paulin enjoyed including. And I think that was one of the spurs we had, wasn't it, Mark, to the series, thinking about, as you say, David, some poems are absolutely straightforwardly political, like a poem about the Spanish Civil War, but these other slightly more complicated cases.
Well, and it has become the vogue in academia to see everything as political. So the new historicism and the kind of waves that have spread from that incline all interpretations and readings to kind of ground every text in its kind of political context. And so that's so much the vogue that you can treat even the most kind of fleeting love lyric as in some ways expressive of all sorts of political urgencies or contingencies. But in the series, we wanted to appeal to our listeners in relation to poems that respond to a particular obvious crisis. I suppose many of the great political poems that we've been considering, such as Yeats's Easter 1916, or Shelley's The Mask of Anarchy, which is about Peterloo, or indeed Auden's poem about the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, are really responding in the moment to a crisis. And poetry was much more the way of responding to the crisis in certain periods than in other periods. But at the same time, there can be a conflict between poems which are explicitly political and presenting a political view and others which are brilliantly political but seem to express no particular political view. We kicked off with Andrew Marvell's Horatian Ode, which is about Cromwell's triumph in the Civil War and his invasion of Ireland. And it is impossible to work out what Marvell thinks of anything in this poem. So we're also interested in the sophistication of political analysis as it's embodied through poetry, and poetry in some ways, you can be more ambivalent, more ambiguous, more nuanced, more subtle, more evasive in a poem, I think, than you can in prose.
And for that reason, is there a point? So at one end, there's a question about where you draw the line. Is a love poem political? Is everything political? And then at the other end, these are the great political poems. But it feels like when a poem is too political, it's not going to be a great poem. And that ambivalence, that ambiguity is not going to survive ideology. So it feels to me a little bit like an ideological poem is going to struggle to qualify as one of the great political poems because it will be too strident. But then, for instance, the Auden, I don't know if you would describe it as ideological, but certainly, I mean, what's so interesting about it, it's clearly a great poem. It's utterly memorable. The lines in it are utterly memorable. It is about a political event, the Spanish Civil War. And yet, as you say in the podcast, he disowned it. He was embarrassed by it because it was too much. And part of the reason it was too much is in some ways it was too certain about what was going on. And with hindsight, he regretted that. So is there a point at which these things, political poetry, are at odds, if by politics we mean ideological conviction?
I think, to take up the Auden point first, one of the things he reproached himself for, particularly in that poem, and this might be a point of more general application, was that he felt that his rhetorical commitment had led him to a kind of political commitment, which wasn't really his own, that the poem, as it were, had a greater kind of ideological certainty or a greater kind of ideological, univocality or whatever than he actually did himself. So it was a kind of a rather astringent self-censoring, I suppose you could say, that he felt he'd betrayed himself by being so rhetorically effective in the politics that he's putting forward. It's a difficult case, the Spain poem, because I agree with you. It's an extraordinary poem. It's an amazing poem. And some of the things that Auden said about it in later life that expressed his dissatisfaction with it just seem, in a way, not true. So those great last lines about history to the defeated may say, alas, but cannot help or pardon, those seem to me extraordinary, powerful, honest, true lines. But Auden came to think that they were just equating historical success with moral goodness. That seems a very odd way to read those lines to me.
Exactly. It's very weird for a poet to think that his own lines have such an unequivocal meaning when to almost any reader they wouldn't have that.
The only way you could possibly read them in that way is if you took the capital H of history and thought it was some kind of numinous Hegelian process or something which is intended and teleological. But if you take history in the normal sense of just the stuff that happens to happen, then I think that what he's saying in those lines is absolutely true. I mean, you can say alas to the people who lost, but of course you can't do anything to help or pardon them because you can't go backwards in time. But I don't know, what do you think about Auden's actions towards his poem, Mark?
Well, people did read the poem and enlist and go over to Spain. So it was part of the kind of fervour of 1936 that people, or 37, that people were so wedded the idea that the Spanish Civil War had to be joined. And Auden's status at that moment was one of a kind of seer or prophet-like figure whose pronouncements did actually have an effect on people. And I think what he's worrying about in some ways is the legacy of W.B. Yeats, who famously said about a play called Kathleen the Houlihan, did that play of mine send out certain men the English shot? And that Yeats's notion that his poetry could make people participate in violence was one which Auden took very, very seriously. And he was anxious not to fall into that trap. So to some extent, his later recantation was part of his distrust or dismissal of Yeats's vision of himself as a kind of political prophet figure or someone who could become an activist. And Auden, as part of or involved in left-wing circles in the 30s, suddenly realized that for him as a poet, this was fatal. Because going back to what I was saying about Marvell, one of the things that poetry is able to dramatize when it is discussing political issues is the freedom of the poet to escape from mind systems, belief systems, ideologies of those who need to get things done in politics. But a poet has a kind of freedom and can resist ideological pressure. And that Auden felt that he was succumbing in this poem to ideological pressure. And you may think of it as a historian as a complete myth that poets sort of nurture, that they have some kind of escape route through poetry from the political pressures of their time. But that was something which Auden came to distrust, his own Prospero-like magic, that he could make people do things. And he much more wanted to associate himself with a free spirit, such as Ariel from The Tempest. And The Tempest was very important to him as a kind of paradigm of the dictator figure who makes people do things in Prospero, and a figure like Ariel, who is a kind of free spirit at the end of the play. And he wanted to preserve that sense of the poet as not having political responsibilities of the kind that a political leader has.
I wanted to ask you about how these poems are used or read today, because one thing about the Auden poem is it is quite dated. I mean, it is literally dated, but one of the ways it's dated is that it's written at a time when he thinks 1937 Spain is the hinge of history. I mean, he says there's yesterday, there's today and tomorrow, and today is Spain, and our tomorrows depend a bit on what's going to happen in Spain. And with hindsight, we know that's not true. Spain was a sideshow, and the hinge of history was coming in 1939, and the great irony or tragic irony of this is that the war that was coming was the one that would decide the future, except in Spain, because fascism would be defeated everywhere except in Spain. I mean, if you'd said to Auden, and at the end of what will actually be the hinge of history, where the really great issues and the greatest war, for better or for worse in history, will resolve these issues, will still leave Franco in power, you would think, well, 1937, that was wrong. But of course, there is that other Auden poem, which is dated September the 1st, isn't it, 1939, which gets cited a lot these days, much more than the 1937 poem. It seems to a lot of people, some of the lines in it, they crop up in sort of political commentary and so on. And then the other Auden poem that seems to me the one that resonates for a lot of people today, it's too short for, I think, you to have had in this series, but Epitaph on a Tyrant, because it feels, just lines like, he knew human folly like the back of his hand. When he laughed, respectable senators burst with laughter. It's quite Trump. I mean, when I read that now, it's not quite right, but it's not far off. Is the 1937 one dated? Were you tempted to do the 1939 one? And Epitaph on a Tyrant, that seems to be the one that, maybe because you can always mock tyrants, that's something timeless about that. But that seems to be the one that really resonates today.
Well, September the 1st, 1939 has had a much more extensive afterlife. It was quoted a lot after the Twin Towers, and it was seen as the kind of archetypal crisis poem for some moment of overwhelming kind of cataclysm, that somehow everything was under attack, that this was the crisis poem that did feature on the internet quite a lot in 2001. Whereas Spain is much more about choice. In some ways, he foregrounds the notion that each individual has to make up their mind whether or not they go to Spain. Whereas September the 1st, 1939, towards the end, it involves this creation almost of a coterie of the like-minded, who these points of light, who in their right-mindedness resist or in some ways commiserate with each other over these vast forces which are beyond the control of the poet. So I think the distance to some extent is one of helplessness, that Spain does present the poet as a political activist in some ways that Auden came to distrust. And later on, September the 1st, 1939, there's a sense in which there's a kind of helplessness which the poet dramatizes. And that is probably closer to how we feel in relation to the tides of history than that sense that, today you can make a difference by signing up and going to Spain. So we are going to cover Louis MacNeice's Autumn Journal in our next poem, which in some ways is a very full book-length poem set in 1938, written sort of to the moment. And that captures much more the sense of Nazism as a kind of creeping force and the ways in which one experiences it on a day-to-day basis. MacNeice can see them building, or Primrose Hill, you can see them building kind of, trenches and kind of cannon places, and there's searchlights and so on. Both Auden and MacNeice have a kind of journalistic aspect, the ways in which they approach poetry, that they were, which is one of the radical and interesting things about 30s poetry, is how open it was to responding to political developments. And certainly September the 1st, 1939, it is also this low dishonest decade. I mean, Auden again scrapped September the 1st, 1939. We must love one another or die is its famous conclusion. And then LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, used that in one of his political ads in the 1960s with children pulling petals off a flower, saying we must love one another or die. And Auden was outraged by that. And that was exactly what he didn't want his poetry to be used for, to make political propaganda. So I brought up The Tempest in my last kind of answer, but Caliban and Ariel are the kind of figures with whom he ends up identifying rather than Prospero. Actually, he played Caliban as a kid at Gresham's when he was at school, and very much identified with him as well as this kind of the kind of monster figure, the outcast figure, the figure who is derided by the mainstream society. And that was one of his images of the poet, as somehow an outcast figure who rejects the dominant ideologies. But how you do reject the dominant ideologies is sort of what Auden then plays out in the rest of his career.
Seamus, do you think, like Mark said, it was in vogue after 9/11, but there's a current almost obsession with trying to work out whether Trump is a fascist or not? I've got to write a piece for The Guardian next month answering the question, is Trump really a fascist or not? And I've been reading about it, and everyone has a view on this. But one of the consequences of this is that some of the poetry of the age of fascism is being brought back. Is it too much of a stretch, do you think, when people try and now, so not so much the Spanish Civil War, but more like a short verse like Epitaph on a Tyrant, try and apply it to now?
I think the 30s poets have also in their plays, of course, because many of them try to dramatize these ideas as well, have a great interest in ideas of autocracy and despotism, and the sense that underwrites lots of political verse of that period, that there is something kind of intrinsically weak about democratic structures, that they don't have any kind of tenacity or staying power. And that may speak to something in the contemporary world. I don't know. Certainly, there's a strong sense in people of Auden's generation that the kinds of political hope that the preceding English literary generation put in concepts like liberalism, that was just dead in the water. One of Spender's many rather homespun, amateurish works of political science is called Forward from Liberalism. And it's just considered self-evident that liberalism's not going to do it for you. So where do you go? A considerable resistance, especially on the part of Auden, for going straight into the hands of communism. And certainly no enthusiasm for lapsing back into a kind of, residual English conservatism. So you're kind of lost in a sort of ideological no man's land in a way. And I think that's what Spain captures rather brilliantly, really. The evocation of what yesterday was like is one thing, and we've got a kind of a glimpse of what tomorrow is going to be like. And then in the middle, there's this kind of rather odd space where political agency or political action or the motivations for political action are actually left pretty obscure. And in all sorts of ways, the most impressive things about the Spain poem aren't really the language of politics at all. When he talks about yesterday, he talks about things like the divination of water and the invention of cartwheels and clocks. And when he looks to tomorrow, the rediscovery of romantic love and the photographing of ravens. I mean, none of these are actually... There's one political term that gets into the poem where he talks about liberty's masterful shadow, but that's the only flash of his verbal imagination being switched on by any recognizable political concept, really, in the poem. And I agree very much with Mark. I think what the 1st of September 1939 represents is, in a way, giving up even that tiny toehold in a world of political discourse and moving on to something else. And when you get love, love appears in almost every poem that Auden ever wrote. He couldn't write a poem without using the word love. But it begins to assume in those later poems, things like 1st September 1939, a tremendous kind of force. And you're not surprised to discover in retrospect that there's only 18 months down the line and he's re-entered the Anglican Church again. So there is another ideological position that's available, which isn't defined by secularism and politics, but by the church. And that's where he goes.
I came across an interesting comment in one of T.S. Eliot's letters. He'd just been to see one of Auden and Isherwood's plays. I think it was The Ascent of F6. And he says in the letter, Hitler is not such a simpleton as they suggest. there was a sense of the 30s poets to someone like Eliot as being somewhat naive in their visions, and that their resistances to kind of creeping fascism taking the form of a kind of schoolboy mask or kind of, a review rather than really responding with due kind of, alarm or with alarm which was sufficiently grave to the crisis posed by Hitler. So undoubtedly, Auden then flees to America or finds himself in America, and a kind of great phase of political poetry is over. And I think in some ways English poetry has struggled since the 30s to be as kind of confident in its politics as the 30s poets felt so much today the struggle that this wasn't something you could dodge or kind of evade. But the later poets are perhaps less willing to, in the post-war era, you get the new apocalyptics like Dylan Thomas and so on, they're less willing to address directly political events. And when one does, such as Philip Larkin, you were asking what are kind of bad political poems. And I was thinking of his 1969 poem, Homage to a Government, which is a poem about Wilson bringing the troops back home from Aden. And Larkin laments this is the kind of decline of empire. We brought them home for money. And I don't think it is a good political poem. I think it's very limited in its understanding of the post-imperial era and its sort of pressing buttons in relation to money and bringing the troops home in a fairly kind of unsophisticated way. So that seems to me an example of a great poet writing a not very good political poem because the issue has somehow overmastered his sense of sophistication or nuance. I don't know. What do you think of Homage to a Government, Seamus?
Well, I wouldn't put it in my top 10 Larkin poems. No, it's true. And there's some odd, funny little kind of satirical squibs, aren't there, about the LSE and things like that he also writes. But I mean, I think they're kind of, I don't know, it's that odd kind of Larkin voice, isn't it, that you get in the letters that he exchanges with Kingsley Amis. And it's Larkin assuming a kind of telegraph voice, which indeed is partly genuinely his voice, but is also partly a kind of, a construction. And I think that's partly what's limiting, isn't it, to the Homage to a Government. It's a single voice poem, isn't it? And the great thing about a really great Larkin poem is it normally has different voices in it of one kind, or different idioms or different registers of one kind or another.
Yes, I wanted to mention, I mean, in terms of Elegy in the Country Churchyard and how you can approach poems which don't seem political, but then suddenly assume all sorts of political charge. At Grass, the last poem in The Less Deceived, is a poem about basically two old racehorses, ex-racehorses galloping around in a field on their own. And this then became, in readings of it, a symbolic expression of post-imperial tristesse, to use a comment of Blake Morrison's, I think, that these two knackered horses somehow represent the post-imperial moment with much greater kind of sophistication and interest and imaginative range than a poem such as Homage to a Government, which directly addresses the fact that Britain has lost or is rapidly losing its kind of status in the post-war era.
But they're both about England gone, aren't they? That's what joins them. As he says in the poem, going, and that'll be England gone. That's the moment that these poems are about in their different ways. As you say, one in a rather beautiful pastoral way and one in this rather kind of tub-thumping way.
And is there a point at which, I've read those letters too, and some of it's not just telegraph stuff, some of it is just outright racism. And he's playing up to Kingsley Amis and vice versa, and to others, Robert Conquest and others. But it's certainly damaged his reputation, I think. But also, is there a sense in which some poems like Homage to Government are more obviously contaminated in a way once you understand the crude political beliefs that lie behind it, in a way that, I don't know, the Whitsun Weddings or something probably isn't going to be contaminated by that? He's an incredibly humane, sympathetic poet. But here's a poem like Homage to Government, which in political terms, it's quite crude. And then you discover that behind it, something even cruder lies. And that one gets dragged sort of posthumously, because a lot of this came out after his death. It kind of gets dragged into the collapse of his reputation, into a pretty nasty politics, whereas some of the other poems surely survive that. And so there is a line somewhere, and some of the poems are on the right side of that line, and Homage to Government's on the wrong side.
Yes, it's an interesting question, though, isn't it, about I mean, to try and imagine the possibility of a really good poem written about some really nasty politics. I mean, that must be a kind of like a thought experiment, mustn't it, that it's worth pausing on. Certainly Auden, in his elegy for Yeats, at least before he goes back and cuts out the stanzas that I'm just about to refer to, in a similar kind of gesture to cutting out Spain from his work altogether. In that poem, Auden does seem to suggest that if you use language properly, if you use language in a kind of reverential and worshipful way in your poems, then time will pardon you. Time, he says, pardoned Kipling and his views. So a whole set of kind of imperialist doctrines that Auden passionately did not believe in, and yet he loved Kipling, and pardoned Paul Claudel, who was an arch-conservative French writer of the first part of the 20th century. And Auden says time pardons him for writing well. So that, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Is it possible to imagine a poem that articulates a politics that you really find a bit off-putting, and yet does it with such extraordinary verbal brilliance or imaginative gift that the poem is good, even though the politics of the poem are not good?
Where does Kipling fit in this? Are you doing Kipling in this series? I'm guessing not.
No, Kipling is an absolutely fabulous poet. I think, I mean, I've been rereading him recently, and he's one of the most wonderful poets in terms of his eloquence. And in a way, his vision of the empire is fairly, he believed in it. I don't think you feel contaminated by it. I think in terms of what Seamus was saying, the Locus Classicus is Ezra Pound's Pisan cantos, which were awarded the Bollingen Prize in 1949, and which were written in the prison camp at Pisa. And he was on trial for being a traitor for his broadcasts to Mussolini. But the poem itself the cantos themselves are full of the most kind of loathsome anti-Semitism and attacks. And he is the great test case for how you value a poet whose technical inventiveness has done all sorts of things for poetry and for other poets, but whose views as kind of embodied in a number of his, of the cantos are utterly repellent. So, and it was given the prize. I forget who was on the committee. Auden, was Auden on the committee? I think he was, wasn't he?
I think Auden was, yeah. He certainly defended the decision. And when his publisher proposed to Pound from the poetry list, on which Auden was also a part, Auden threatened to take himself elsewhere if they did that.
And that's a good example, isn't it, of how the poet likes to think of poetry can somehow have a sphere in which it's uncontaminated by the political, or the political can somehow not affect one's understanding or assessment of it.
Yes, and Yeats for Auden was also a good example of that, because obviously Yeats's political views, especially as the 30s go on, get more and more, what should we say, cranky. And he writes, in late poems like The Statues, which is an extraordinary, amazing poem, but it's a weird poem about how Ireland has to kind of remodel itself on the geometric norms of classical Greece and get outside of the filthy modern tide, which we've been thrown upon. And there's a really strong kind of eugenics kind of feel to that poem. And yet that late Yeats voice, for some time at least, Auden really admired, while disagreeing with almost everything that late Yeats voice was saying. So there is a kind of odd kind of division between, as it were, what's said and the way that it's said, in some cases at least.
Can I ask you about a couple of the other poems that you've discussed already in the series? So one is the Yeats that you mentioned, Easter 1916, because that's also a poem with a date, but I would say it's less, in lots of ways it's less dated. I suspect it's more widely read than Spain 1937. I don't know if that's partly because it's about political failure in a way. So it doesn't have that sense that Auden does, which is he hasn't seen the ways in which this is going to fail yet. But also it's so weirdly personal. He's writing about people that he knew. It's not that the personal is the political is the personal in that poem. I think you say in the podcast, this is Dublin. They all knew each other. They were all bumping into each other in the streets. And then a bunch of them go and get themselves shot, leaving the poet to think, what was that? And so there's something, it's an amazing poem. These are all amazing poems, but there's something, I hate to use this word, but almost relatable about it, which is that feeling of you're in the middle of a dramatic political event and some people have gone one way and some people have gone another. I don't know, but it certainly to me feels a lot, in its way, a lot less dated. I don't know if that's the wrong word to use, but I'm thinking of the two that have dates in the title.
Well, yes, I mean, I think also it's a slightly different case in the extent to which the Irish Revolution was about language much more than the Spanish Civil War. That the fatal things which the British did were to create martyrs out of the 16 men who were killed. And Yeats's own participation in that creation of a mythology is much more, in some ways, politically effective. And although he hedges his bets, a terrible beauty is born, creates a sort of sense of his own sidelining by this particular event, which took him by surprise. He does commemorate them. I write it out in a verse, so that the extent to which the poem itself is participating in the event, for many people, it has become the event. I mean, Easter 1916 is, and when you read a historical account of Easter 1916, you realize what a complete botch the whole thing was, how no one rose up. And it really does become, it does work on the level of symbolism. And I think we mentioned in the podcast how Lenin kind of observed what was happening there. And he thought, yeah, they're onto something here. That it doesn't actually matter what happens. It matters how it is framed and the mythology which can derive from it. And Yeats, in his own way, wanted to be a part of it, but he didn't want to. He obviously was against violence.
And I said it's the great failure, but of course it's the failure that becomes a success, unlike Spain, where it's being built up as this enormous thing, but with hindsight, it wasn't that. This is the thing that, partly thanks to Yeats, does build up to be the thing that it wanted to be in its dreams.
Yes, that's true. Though, again, the terms in which Yeats puts those events of Easter 1916 are curiously unpolitical, aren't they, in any kind of normally recognizable way. And he himself is surprised, isn't he? Mark, do you remember there's a letter that we discussed at one point about he seems genuinely surprised that he's so moved by a public event, because he's not interested in public things. I mean, he's interested in the deep internal worlds of imagination and vision and, possibly Celtic legends, if something like that, but really not interested in public events. And I think also quite striking that Morgane, who was absolutely political through and through, didn't like it. She didn't think it rose to the occasion. She obviously, I mean, the way I interpret her remarks to Yeats, no, I don't like your poem. It isn't worthy of you. And above all, it isn't worthy of its subject. Is that he's somehow failed to write a sufficiently political poem for her. And in a way, if you read it absolutely straight and don't look at the footnotes that identify who the participants are and so on, the thrust of the poem is that what's so great about what's happened is a new kind of beauty has been launched in the world. So it's actually a poem in a funny kind of way about aesthetics, or about a new kind of aesthetic experience, and not really about a political defeat or indeed a political failure. Especially when you get to the end, when for all that is done and said, we know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. This isn't the language of militant republicanism, is it? I don't think.
But he was also moved by a public event, which was a private event. It would be odd in a way not to be moved by people being dragged out and shot. It's sort of, if he hadn't known any of these people, if it hadn't been his world, he might have been unmoved by it. It would take a heart of stone in a way. This is the public event which is also absolutely touching him personally.
Yes, that's right. But there is still that same kind of odd kind of transformational magic that the poem works on what, as Mark says, was actually a bit of a kerfuffle and a botched uprising, and yet is turned into something with this kind of extraordinary, terrible beauty. It's like Lear or something, isn't it? It's that kind of level of poetic achievement. Mark and I were both supervised by John Bailey years ago, and he keeps cropping into our conversations in rather an irritating way. But anyway, he once said of Auden that what Auden learnt from Yeats was how to, as it were, get into a situation and then make it stylish. You take a situation which appears, an international episode of potentially momentous historical significance, like Spain or like the Easter Uprising in Dublin, but you devote all your poetic energies into turning it into something stylish, into something that is personal, highly kind of personal, poetic, individual. I mean, in a way, kind of easing it away from the world of public discourse and public engagement into something which is much more self-created and self-delighting in all sorts of ways. I don't know what you think about that, Mark.
Well, I agree. I think in terms of Yeats's career, his engagement with politics made him into a better poet. that he's his greatest poetry was written after, say, 1914 onwards, and that whereas politics can ruin some poets, it made Yeats as a poet, that no one wants more of the wanderings of Rushin, but they do want more even of his proto-fascist poems, because the rhetoric is so kind of startling and original and powerful, and the versification is so astonishing, and the commitment and energy is so high, so that I think he is a good example of a poet whose politicization, I mean, Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry was how Auden put it in his elegy. And I think that the extent to which you cannot dissever Yeats's achievement from the Irish struggle for independence is or you can, but his most interesting ways of reading him. There's a great essay on him by Edward Said, reading him as a post-colonial poet, that frankly, this is the kind of poet he was, somebody whose imagination is engaged with and excited by the whole process of forging the conscience of his race, to use Joyce's phrase from the end of Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man.
The most recent episode in your series is about Strange Meeting by Wilfred Owen, which I'm guessing is probably the poem that's best known by people who are listening, because it's still ubiquitous, I think, in schools. And it's also interesting because it's not like those other two that we've just been talking about. It's not Spain 1937, it's not Easter 1916, it's not about a political event. It's about the First World War, which is a political event, but it's not trying to pin down a public event. When you discuss it, you talk quite a lot about its political effects, as it were, its afterlife in the 20s. Owen's poetry was immensely powerful and influential. Auden might have persuaded one or two people to sign up to Spain, but my God, Owen's poetry persuaded a lot more people than that war was wrong. And it had profound political consequences in 1920s, 1930s Britain. But in your episode, there was a bit of the poem that you didn't talk about that I wanted to ask you about. So after I listened to you, I then went and reread it. And then I thought, well, there is a bit in here that is straightforwardly political, and you haven't discussed it. So I might have misread it. You're going to have to put me right on this. You can give me a supervision here. But you talked about Owen as a sort of prophetic poet. And it seems to me there's one bit of this that is profoundly prophetic. So this poem is about his doppelganger. So it's about the German Wilfred Owen. And he's killed him. So Wilfred Owen has killed the German Wilfred Owen because he's killed the poet of the war, who would have been the German poet of the war. So there is no German poet of the war to be Wilfred Owen. And the German Wilfred Owen talks about how the world will go in the absence of him because he's no longer there. And the lines that you didn't discuss, so maybe I misread them, but they feel extraordinarily prophetic to me. The German Wilfred Owen says, because I'm not around to write my poetry, to sort of wash the chariot wheels of their blood, now men will go content with what we spoiled, or discontent, boil bloody and be spilled. They will be swift with swiftness of the tigress. None will break ranks, though nations trek from progress. And you could say the tragic prophetic irony of this poem is that's quite a good description of 1920s and 1930s Germany. So the British Wilfred Owen lives long enough to have his political effects, but he's killed his German equivalent, as a result of which the world of politics is going to go a particular way. Is that too literal a reading of it? Because you didn't talk about those lines, but it seems to me there was a little bit in this poem where it does speak about the public world of politics and the future, and it's eerie reading it.
Yes, I've just written a piece on Owen for the LRB, and I don't discuss those lines, but I discuss Strange Meeting and the extent to which it does create a vision of loss of all direction, that all the ways of understanding the world, interpreting the world, making sense of the world are kind of tossed into this cauldron, and they all kind of fall apart in various ways. And that sense of disintegration is proleptic of a poem like The Wasteland, in which all sorts of kind of, things are conjugated in relation to kind of failure and despair. I think the extent to which Owen was a committed European, that he spent all this time in Bordeaux, and he learned fluent French, and he was, as much as Eliot, committed to a vision of Europe. So in those lines that you mentioned, and I think you're absolutely right, apologies to our listeners for not discussing them in our podcast, you can see that the whole vision of a trek, this idea of the kind of pioneering spirit. You associate it with the Boers and so on, and the Boer War. But this from progress, that Owen was committed to the idea of progress in some ways, and that poets would play their part in this trek towards progress, but that the slaughter of them was apocalyptic because they could no longer play their role in the formation of a kind of meaningful sort of body politic in terms of the myths which hold nations together. And it is interesting because Owen was quite a patriotic poet, as well as being as taken as the sort of great kind of outspoken denunciator of war. In some ways, he was also extremely patriotic and committed to the war effort. And he could have got out of going back. I mean, Scott Moncrieff tries to get him out of it. And it's not decided really until quite late in the autumn, late summer of 1918, that he's going to go back. But certainly, I think Strange Meeting, which is a very, in some ways, influential poem still today, because as you say, every school kid in the country reads it. And another way it's interesting is it's a kind of homoerotic poem as well. It's a poem about two men grappling together in the dark. One kills the other. But there are ways in which, for Owen, the First World War was not only appalling cataclysm, but it was also ways in which men bonded together in the most intense and exhilarating of ways. And conflict itself becomes almost a kind of erotic struggle in Strange Meeting. That could tie into kind of Freudian notions of the death drive, I suppose, or concepts of the ways in which war itself is responding to some kind of deep atavistic tribal drive in us, as much as it is to the kind of crisis in contemporary politics.
I should say the series that I've been doing on great political fictions and dramas begins with Coriolanus. And actually what this reminded me of was Coriolanus and Orphidius. There's a bit in Coriolanus where they're grappling in exactly this way, and it's very deeply homoerotic and similar. So I heard that echo. But Seamus, I don't know enough to know whether there were German anti-war poets equivalent to Owen and Sassoon. But one of the weird things about Strange Meeting is it makes a big claim for poetry. I mean, it seems to me it makes an extraordinary claim for poetry, which is because you've killed the poet, the world is going to go this way rather than that way. And the odd thing is that there is some truth in that. The poets of the First World War were extraordinarily influential. Germany got the great anti-war novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, but almost too late. By the time that came out, it was in time for the Nazis to burn it. But this stuff is coming out in 1918 and beyond. I don't know if prophetic is too big a word for this, but I really found it eerie just thinking about those lines and the thought that, the poets weren't there. They were there in this country, but they weren't there. I mean, Germany lost the war, so it's going to be a different kind of anti-war poetry. And politics is politics, and history is history, and maybe poetry doesn't make any difference. But this poem makes that weirdly huge claim for poetry. You're going to get a different world if you kill the poet.
No, absolutely. And although young Auden was a great admirer of Owen and thought that Owen was better than a poet like Siegfried Sassoon because he seemed less polemical in his anti-militarism, I think Auden, in a way, got Owen wrong, because I think Owen was absolutely committed to the idea of the social, political utility of poetry in a way that Auden, as we've been discussing, moves away from pretty quickly. You can see all that in the little preface that Owen writes to the volume of poems that obviously he never sees into print, where he talks about the poet having a job to warn, and the kind of visionary mode in which a poem like Strange Meeting is written is clearly drawing upon the visionary, the more kind of Dante-esque poems of someone like Shelley, who we've looked at. And Shelley was absolutely of the view that poets were the unacknowledged legislators of mankind, that the writing that was actually going to determine the way in which human history unfolded was, in some sense, poetic writing. Now, he draws poetry quite broadly. He's not just talking about lyrics, but nevertheless, that same impulse, that same ambition is there. And I think that's where Owen's getting it from. He's a late romantic with a capital R in that sense. So later Auden, when he gives his lectures in Oxford, is very keen to point out that what poets like are things like thunderstorms and conflagrations and colourful things like that. And he tells his audience that the attributes of a poet are a very undesirable thing in a statesman. You don't want those things.
And this discussion makes me kind of aware of the extent to which, say, the battle between Trump and Biden is fought out through language. In a way, they are both poets. They're fighting each other. They're battling each other. And it's the domination of language, which is what poets write, which in some ways is how politics kind of articulates itself or communicates itself. So, I mean, Trump has published his poems, as you probably know. They were presented as poems, weren't they? Some of his sayings, but the ways in which some particular kind of phrases can connect with the public imagination is something that politicians and poets share.
There's that cliched line, you campaign in poetry, you govern in prose. And I was thinking of it, tell Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak that you campaign in poetry. I didn't feel like we just had 6 weeks of poetry to be replaced by prose. But Trump is so interesting. I don't know if poetry is the word for it, but one of his distinguishing characteristics as a politician is he doesn't govern. He doesn't actually see any difference between the rhetoric inside and outside government. It's kind of all the same. His first term in office was notable for how little governance went on. It was just the rhetoric continuing. And he is that very unusual politician. He is all language. I mean, there isn't anything else there. He is all language and all projection. And that line from Auden that I quoted, it does seem to be, I mean, I'm not sure when he laughed, respectable senators burst with laughter, because I'm not sure they're respectable anymore. But he knew human folly like the back of his hand, seems to me a very good line for Trump. He's not a simpleton. He is a profound student of human weakness. One of his poetic devices is to give people nicknames. And he's brilliant at it. He's struggling to find one for Kamala Harris. I think he's still feeling his way, but he destroys his rivals in that way. He is a very unusual politician. I don't know if poet is the word for him, but whatever he does when he campaigns, it just carries on.
Well, that does go back to this old traditional flyting, Flyting, which Scottish poets would do, and they would sort of insult each other. And that was the way in which you expressed your poethood. Certainly in the mass media world, social media world, or the disastrous debate that they had, that's sort of what's supposed to happen, and only Biden didn't show up.
The last episode in the fiction series that I've done is Hamilton, which is interesting because it's the hip-hop founding fathers, but Lin-Manuel Miranda says part of what drew him to it is hip-hop has this way of communicating, which is insult. It's just, so he does cabinet meetings as Jefferson and Hamilton just trying to take each other down like they were, in some kind of hip-hop beef. I use these terms, it sounds ridiculous, people like me saying hip-hop beef. I don't even know if that's the right term. But it works because politics is very like that, actually. But it's also extraordinarily lyrical. I think the lyrics in Hamilton are genius because they are so intricate. But it is that thing of the intricacy of the insult, which actually, Trump is brilliant at.
It's utterly fantastic, Hamilton. I've seen it several times and I've teach it as well. I think it's one of the greatest reconfigurations of a sort of political system there has ever been. The idea that kids see a black Washington is itself kind of exhilarating, but also that the bit when Jefferson and Hamilton are fighting it out, and we all know who does the planting, where it's the one sort of gesture to kind of slavery, or one of the gestures to slavery in it, but it's inexplicit in the ways in which it. And I think that the poetry that Miranda comes up with stands up both on the page and in performance.
So can I ask quickly a final couple of questions? I think you're halfway through your series. What's coming up?
We were going to do Autumn Journal by Louis MacNeice, and also going back to the French Revolution, books 9 and 10 of The Prelude by Wordsworth, which are a really astonishing register of, again, a political kind of cataclysm. And it's interesting because there are two, there's the 1805 and the 1850, and Wordsworth ends up a kind of conservative, but nevertheless, they are, in terms of a poetic representation of a historical crisis, they're as astonishingly full and vivid. He was there. He was there and suffering in his attic room, his chambre de bonne, waiting for, and every day a new execution was happening. And so he was in the tiger's den.
Finally, so I've just finished this political fiction series. I just wanted to ask you, because I'm really curious, and we've got some of our regular contributors coming on to talk about their favourite political fiction. So Leah Ippey's doing The Wild Duck. It's not particularly political. Helen Lewis, To Kill a Mockingbird. And then Robert Saunders, who's been our guide to historic elections, is doing Felix Holt. So I did Middlemarch, but, and I'm now reading Felix Holt, and I'd already been put off it, but actually it's great. It's quite hard work, but it's great. What do you think are the great, or is the great political novel? Or is that too sweeping a question?
Well, I didn't choose. I noticed you haven't got any Dickens there. Dickens seems to me the greatest kind of political novelist there's ever been. The one I sort of decided to choose for when you asked, what's your favourite, was Nicholas Nickleby, which is a kind of early one in which sort of G.K. Chesterton talks about how there's more of the French Revolution in Nicholas Nickleby than there is in A Tale of Two Cities, that it's got these anarchic, liberational energies released in it. And it's also utterly hilarious. But it's also got really solid social political action, that there were these Yorkshire schools where parents would send unwanted children. No vacations was always advertised. And it's basically to get rid of illegitimate children. Dickens goes up there. He writes this episode with Wackford Squeers. He denounces these schools, makes fun of them. Within 15 years, they're closed down. So in terms of a novelist who has a political effect on particular issues, as well as articulating a kind of humane and generous and moving attitude to all who are in suffering or outcasts, like Smike and Nicholas Nickleby. I just think that Dickens gets much more sophisticated in his political analysis in Bleak House or Little Dorrit. But in these early ones, there's a kind of clarity about it and an energy which is unself-conscious and which I find particularly powerful.
I think I'm going to nominate Under Western Eyes by Joseph Conrad. Conrad is a fascinating novelist, partly because he is so interested in politics in a kind of conceptual way. And one of the things that's underlying Under Western Eyes is pretty deep and serious reading in nihilist literature of the period and revolutionary writing by Bakunin and people like that. So he really is coming at it with a set of, and he's fascinated in this book about what liberalism means, what liberty means, what does freedom mean, all these sorts of things. So he really is coming at it in, as I say, that kind of conceptual way, but finds the most brilliant dramatic kind of scenario within which to explore those things. So it's set in Russia and in Geneva, and it's all about a student called Razumov who gets caught up quite unwillingly in revolutionary violence, an assassination that's been done. And he either finds himself complicit with the revolutionaries or complicit with the autocratic Russian state, which Conrad is very, very clear is appalling. It's not like they're revolutionaries against a decent regime. Both the regime and the revolutionaries are appalling. And one of the interesting, fascinating things about the book is the way that Conrad develops this sort of parallel between the psychology of revolutionary violence on the one hand and the psychology of autocracy as a governmental system on the other hand. And that what look as though they are embattled opponents are actually part of the same system. And poor old Razumov, the student who's caught in the middle, I won't give the plot away, but anyway, it's not a very happy outcome for him in the end. And it's Conrad making an extraordinarily powerful point about the relationship between certain kinds of political liberty and certain kinds of moral identity. And if you lose one, Conrad's implicit point is then you lose the other, and a moral life becomes impossible. It's very powerful. It's a brilliant reimagining of Dostoevsky and other kind of fraught sort of existentialist novels like that, but very much in the terms of political thinking and political ideas.
If you'd like to hear more from Seamus and Mark, and I don't normally say this, but it really is a brilliant series. I've been listening to it avidly. You can hear about the great political poems on the LRB's Close Readings podcast simply by searching for Close Readings. If you subscribe, you also get access to many previous series by Seamus and Mark talking about poems, but also LRB series about literature from ancient Greece to the present day. We are now going to be talking to a couple of our regular contributors about their favourite political fictions. But just a reminder, if you subscribe to PPF Plus, you can now get a bonus episode, which is me talking to Robert Saunders about George Eliot's Felix Holt. You just need to go to ppfideas.com or follow the link in the show description. Next time, I'm going to be talking to Leah Ippey about a play that she has known since she was 8 years old. And she explains to us just what it has meant in her life. It's by Ibsen, it's called The Wild Duck, and it's an amazing story. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.